next speaker is Simon Cutts. Simon is a poet and publisher, and he began working with Stuart Mills at Terrestre Press in the 1960s, and in 1975 founded Coracle, which in the subsequent years has become an influential publishing enterprise internationally and a seminal project for the development of alternative forms and spaces in which artists can operate. Together with Erica Van Horn, he currently directs Coracle from its base in Tipperary, Ireland. Simon.
Good morning. So my piece is called The Cost of a Couple of Movies, which is something that Sol LeWitt dropped in a small written piece, and many of us are kind of hazy about the date of this thing, but it's somewhere in the mid 60s, 66, 7 probably, and I can't remember the context, but I did use it in a small catalogue back in 1980, and one's not an academic, so the referencing was not picked up as crucial as it should have been maybe, but I know a lot of you are aware of this statement, which said, "I can only say that the gallery as it is constituted in our time has the obligation to show the art of the time. I am more interested in artists' books, which contain art ideas that can be had by anyone for the cost of a couple of movies. Art really cannot be bought and sold, but only understood. Books do this best. The gallery is best as publisher." So there's tantalizing ideas lurking alongside that statement, I think, just to really push the boat out far. If you understand a piece, then you own it. And I think Bertolt Brecht said somewhere along the line that everything belongs to the one who's best for it. Pushing the boat out maybe too far for the purposes of this conference. But in 1968, Sol LeWitt made this rather enigmatic work, which is called Buried Cube, containing an object of importance but of little value. It was a period between the initial physical cube structures of the earlier 60s and the beginning of the war drawings, which he continued for the rest of his life. In a paragraph accompanying the work in the MoMA catalogue of 1978, I believe, he cites Gertrude Stein, who said that a work of art is either priceless or worthless. It's a very interesting use of Gertrude Stein in a way to associate with Sol LeWitt's work, I feel. And it sort of begins for me to bring a new generativeness to the whole process of working, a new openness, in fact, to work made by artists. And at the same time, it displaces some of the pejorative hierarchy of forms from the most physical to the most ephemeral, like the ephemerality of the war drawings. It changes classification in some ways. It is within this openness, this revision of possibilities of the time, that I want to look at the implications for the gallery as publisher, which is a phrase that we use at Coracle a great deal, and by extension to the gallery as a format. I think these ideas are coming from sort of that simple statement of LeWitt and other things he said at different periods, which I'll pick up on. The gallery is a format which is almost a device of publication, of editorial in a way. Yeah, of editorial and of a grouping of serial presentation, even if it comes to that. I'm going to do this with examples from Coracle, which is kind of what I know about, since that's what I did over the years, mainly from the intermediate period of the 1980s. And it may not necessarily always follow the schematic serial approach of Sol LeWitt, but it is a view of some of the practical implications and pointers from his work, I feel. In this way, it might even be the opposite of his conceptualism at times, about which he said, "The serial artist does not attempt to produce a beautiful or mysterious object, but functions merely as a clerk, cataloguing the results of the premise." The gallery as publisher is an interesting kind of whole concept, and I thought I might just read to you a couple of cards from a rather equally enigmatic work from a guy called Jerry Hunt, an artist called Jerry Hunt, which somehow came to our attention in the gallery in 1980. And Jerry is a very wide artist in many ways, but he did have these text works called Some Principles and Practice of 12 Modern Art Styles. And we issued these Some Principles and Practice as like a series of like flashcards to pass your examinations, even if you like, you know. And there's a sort of irony at work in Jerry's text, which I think actually is quite parallel to this work of Sol's in some ways, but it's more for the content of these pieces. I'm going to read a couple to you. They range from Impressionism to Expressionism to Pointillism to Cubism, how to make works in those styles. Two of the most intriguing for our attention now, though, I think, in the period we're talking about, are these two, how to make work in the conceptual style. Conceptual art originated in Europe and New York in the late 1960s. Conceptualism can be understood both as a reaction against the formalism of preceding art object-based styles and a formalist style itself. Its main characteristic is an attempt to present the art idea without the traditional art object. Although the work must have a form in order to exist, the aesthetics are located in the idea. The work commonly manifests itself in the written or spoken word, human action or interaction, still photography, film and video, singly or in combination. Photography, film, video, and the written word are also used simply as a recording of the enactment of the work, when it is distant in time or place. Some familiarity with the disciplines of semiology, anthropology, philosophy, and political theory is necessary to appreciate and operate this style. Compared with formalist styles using the traditional languages of painting and sculpture, conceptualism has opened up a new media and systems for visual artists to operate in, which allow for a less enigmatic, more specific engagement with life experience. First, you have to have an idea. Try to present it as clearly and succinctly as possible without relying on your chosen non-painting sculpture mediums aesthetics. Having completed the first draft version as originally planned, try to see how well it communicates your idea. It may need a different presentation, or a secondary element might even need to be made primary. Repeat this process of redrafting until you are satisfied with the result. Remember, you're in the intuitive information business. Interesting kind of aside on things we may be talking about. Another one I really like is how to make minimal art, which really skirts the whole issue. It's the second corollary on the position. Minimal art originated in Europe in the middle 1960s. One strain of minimalism carries the non-relational element of some flat colour abstraction into a predominantly three-dimensional form, a primary structure, avoiding the categories of both painting and sculpture. The work is of necessity very highly conceptual, relying for much of its effect on a strong gestalt, defying the spectator to find more in terms of internal relationships. This rejection of internal relationships often avoids the possibility of anthropomorphic readings, and by an acute sense of scale relative to environment, this art produces a convincing immanence. First, conceive of a three-dimensional statement as to its scale, size, and material colour. Minimal painting, on the other hand, can be very handmade. It is mainly characterised by the use of quiet colours, repetitive structures like grids, and other quasi-geometrical abstractions. You should study the work of the following pioneers, and there's a list. Please, Sol LeWitt, of course. So I think this was quite an interesting thing for a gallery, not very formed gallery in South London, to produce as a kind of way of criticism. And it began to formulate the idea that the gallery could function as a publisher of such material, tangential at first, more central eventually. But then we sort of moved away from just that critical premise to, there it is in its little folder, and you can see the cards spread out. There are some art galleries around the globe that have this thing pinned up on pillars between works. I don't think they're quite, oops, what do I do there? Okay, press OK. Okay, that's it. Sorry. Yeah, they have this thing pinned up, and I think they don't quite recognise the irony of the work. They think it is really just pure information, but of course it's stylized, it's conjectured, it moves from a critical voice. But moving from that critical aspect of things, oops, the wrong way, didn't we? About 1984, we made an exhibition with Richard Long in the small space in Camberwell, South London. And this was about the time that Richard Long was starting to use mud as a medium he could carry around the globe with him. He could put it in a small bottle, go to Tokyo, make a huge museum show, very versatile. It was always River Avon mud at this time. And we decided from the show, or at the time of the show, we wanted to make this book called Mud Handprints, which was like a modular of the material and the use of things in the space of the gallery. And Mud Handprints was made in 1984 in a small edition, 100 copies. It said on the colophon it was hand printed in Camberwell to play with the mythology of limited edition, small handmade books and so on. And I think what's happening here is that, you know, the publication is becoming the work in a way. I mean, this thing lasts outside the gallery show, lasts much longer. I mean, this is sort of the beginning, I think, of a way of publication becoming the work. We did several things with those kind of artists in that early 80s, early to mid 80s sort of time. And the other one, which I think is really one of the great books from Chronicle, is Twilight Horizons of Hamish Fulton, which in a way again supplants an exhibition and makes the publication the real focus. I think these ideas are latent in certain strands of LeWitt's thinking. I mean, although he stays totally within the confines of his own work in a way, I think I'm drawing implications about things from Sol LeWitt in a sense. I hope you bear with me on that. So Hamish Fulton, Twilight Horizons, and then a page from Twilight Horizons, another page from Twilight Horizons. And about this time, Hamish Fulton was starting to paint these line horizons of the Mount Isis as Nepal, as he said in the colophon to the book. And in a way, this is the work. You know, this book, printed like this, is the work, in a sense. And it moves, again, slightly sideways from LeWitt's premise, but I think is completely contained within this project. This is upside down, because it's a series of gallery invitations from about this time, the mid-80s, late 70s, mid-80s to mid-80s, and an odd sneaky one in from even the 20s and the noughties over there. But it's upside down because it's photographed through a glass case, and I couldn't work out which side of the case to stand. But you get the idea, in some ways, of the kind of object-y invitations we might have made or sent out for various shows. We were playing with the idea of the gallery as publisher towards the gallery as a format, always referencing this place that we worked in as a centre in some way. So much so that I would decide to make collective shows, which are almost like I don't kind of know what their purpose was at the time, but there were 3 or 4 very curious collective shows, and this one, 1980, begins to move my thread towards the gallery as a kind of format in a way. This show was called On Loan, and the catalogue for the show was this little box with these reader's tickets, like a library reader's ticket. Every artist in the show had a reader's ticket like this. And it had the information about the piece, the dimensions, all that kind of stuff. And yeah, what was I going to say about that? Yeah, this became a format. The show itself, On Loan, was really a kind of spoof in a way. I mean, I invited artists to lend something to an exhibition which would reflect their sensibility, their aesthetic, their work, but it wasn't actually a work. You know, it was just something alongside their work which pointed towards the corpus of what they were doing in some way. I mean, there were a lot of other people in this, critics, curators, as well as artists. And there was a curator who worked at the Tate Gallery called David Brown. And David Brown lent to this exhibition a very famous piece, or one of these pieces of Sol LeWitt, where he cut out of a map of the city a quadrilateral. And this piece was in the possession of David Brown, and he lent this to this particular on-loan exhibition, in a way. He did. 77 Sol LeWitt piece. There are, I don't know how many of these map pieces there are. There's quite a few kind on there. I mean, yeah. Right. Yeah, exactly. Right. Anyway, so that was some cross-currenting of parts from the on-loan catalogue to, and the space itself was something we were celebrating in Camberwell. It was a small milliner shop lined with these tongue and groove boards, and another collective show made in '83 with some of these guys you all know about. We used a bit of Japanese paper which tried to reflect the walls of the gallery in some way. I mean, you've got to take certain poetic liberties and possibilities of extension on this. But Tongue and Groove was done as this poster where there were cutouts and stick-ons and sewings and replacements. And here I think we're seeing this wee gallery working, almost beginning to think about working as a format in some way. This gets much more intact as an idea with something like this, which was a project called Allotment in Liverpool in 1987, whereby this huge space was stripped out to make work, to make different kinds of work. But first of all, we made this piece with Richard Long called Stone Field. And the idea that this space would be allotted to an artist. There were projects lined up that didn't go any further for whatever dubious economic reasons. And we kind of lost the space after a while. I mean, we were kind of invading big civic space in a way, and people didn't like that without whole institutional kind of backup to it in some way. So we lost the space, but the idea is still paramount, it's still important, that this idea that you could use a space as a format and bequeath it like a magazine issue or something, where you invite an artist to actually come and make a work in this space. This is a supremely good example, I think, of the gallery working as a format. Again, I think this kind of projects from LeWitt's ideas to some extent, but taken in maybe some contradictory ways by the other poetic of Coracle in some way. I should say that about this time we'd made this big exhibition for the Crafts Council of Great Britain called the Artist Publisher. This was like just in the middle of all this kind of stuff, mid-80s, and it was a big survey show of the activity of this area in a way. And a reason I bring it up is just I think some of the headings in this were really important. Perhaps the most important was the one sort of opening section, which was called Self-Publishing as a Critical Alternative, something which I'm always returning to in another way, and you can see that evidence from the necessity of that from LeWitt's books too, to some extent. Self-publishing as a critical alternative. And this was followed by a group, this was followed by other things, artist manifestos, magazines and journals, alternative newspapers, artist presses, gallery presses, fluxes, mail art and the new ephemera, rubber stamps, and published musical scores. It was quite a wide-ranging field to this book. And didn't sort of narrowly just deal with what was called the artist book. It just looked at the whole gamut of what artists had published in some way. I think also endemic in all this is the idea that a book space might be the equivalent of a physical space. That what you can do with folds, glue, sewing, covers, interiority in books, might also equivalence the space, a physical space that you were familiar with, going on from the gallery's format in some way. And Colin Sackett devised this format for a project in Hamilton Finlay and myself. I had this work called A Line of Thin Pale Blue, which is a translation of a line from the French poet Stéphane Mallarmé. And Finlay, in the other bit, had A Line of Thin Pale Red, which was the line of thread around the throat of the tricoteurs who sat at the guillotine watching who was being beheaded. And these two works existed as two small neon works in a long corridor space, very, very narrow. Almost to the point that you could never get into the space and see both works at the same time. You'd be looking here and have this kind of red hue, you'd be looking here and have this blue hue, but you could never really focus the entire work in this space. So in a way, I think what's happened here is Colin Sackett came up with a format that developed this interiority of this space, the problem of being in this space, and also the hiddenness of the pieces in a certain way, in the physical space. I mean, I haven't extrapolated very far on this, but I think this idea of equivalent space is a really important thing for publication to still follow. And there's still, I say to students all the time, you know, there's still things to be done with folds of paper, cover, cotton, glue, you know, that haven't been discovered, that haven't actually been developed yet. I think it's a very optimistic possibility still to go on there. I thought just for sort of devilment, in a way, I would throw in a diagrammatic tangent, which may be to some extent like a diagrammatic in LeWitt's work, about how you might start off to make a 16-page section for a book. I mean, these are kind of really rough, just thrown together, sort of little dummies I did, so you have to forgive them. But here's a sheet of A3 paper folded into eight pages with their corresponding numbers, and the way it unfolds and backs up. You know, this is a kind of complicated diagram in a way, as this one too is a diagram for the paging of a book. And I would sort of conjecture in a way that, there's another one there, that's your storyboard one, that should come first. The first one should come second, and the last one maybe third, I don't know, you know, anyway. I'm just throwing this up as like a diagrammatic possibility to do with editions and editioning, and to say, maybe the understanding of making the edition, this way of laying it out, can change. In fact, the content of the work can actually change by this method, you know. In a way, the LeWitt drawing can change by the way in which the instruction is interpreted, in a way, you know. Yeah, and it's this understanding of the schematic limitation and reduction of the process of the printed work that may change the whole conception of the piece, in a way. I think, you know, when you're working with young people, your students and other people, you see how they don't believe that these pages back each other in this pulled out piece of A3 paper. You know, they can't believe that that's backing on that number. You know, then you fold it up, you cut the top, you suddenly realize you have this 16-page section, the absolute increment of a part of a book. So in a way, I think, just to throw that out, you know, there's a diagrammatic from what I do, and small publishers do more commonly, is that might have some reference to the thing we're talking about. I think then to say there's always maybe been for poets the idea of concrete poetry, you know, that legitimated the sanctioned the use of wall space in a way, that you could take something from the book to a wall space or back again to an object hanging on the wall. And this concrete poetry phenomenon was largely a European, South American derivation maybe in some ways. This is in Hamilton Finlay, Canal Stripe 3 from 1964, so very early. As is this next one, this is another page from Canal Stripe 3 of Finlay's. But what's interesting here, I think, is the way in which Finlay is working with serial things. I mean, this is Canal Stripe 3, and this is Ocean Stripe 5. You know, there were these Canal Stripe and Ocean Stripe series of Finlay. I don't think, in a way, he was aware of the seriality of American acompositional things at this point. But I want to get onto that in a minute. It is this idea of this seriality that I think is really important. I think something began to happen, you know, there with the American conceptualists in the late 1960s, and it provided another impetus for presented work in a way, which I think the poets working at the time were only very half-consciously aware. It began to creep up maybe in the 70s and even into the 80s far more, you know, this idea there was a different level of composition or non-composition. I think this non-composition came out of the American aesthetic in some way, where you have an overallness from minimalism, an overallness, homogeneity. These things were kind of counter to the European Gestalt theory and the development of formality in a European sense that I think concrete poetry came from, in a way. And I think people began to take this on board very slowly, I mean very slowly. This is Thomas A. Clarke, A Herb Garden, 1980. And I wouldn't suggest he's got this like in his head that this is something else other than what you can do with flat sheets of colored paper to make a metaphor in a way. But I think it begins to move out from the formal language base of the European concrete poetry. I mean, you can begin to see that working, like as well in those artists like Hamish Fulton, where those early photographic works of Fulton were really not composition at all. I mean, they were photographs, but it didn't matter what the photograph was in a certain way. They weren't photography. It was a cross-section of a journey, and he took a picture in the middle of that journey, and he presented that as the whole journey. This is a kind of different way of thinking about composition or formal things, which really I think is an American aesthetic in some ways. It comes out of John Cage, maybe, and a whole different look. Thomas A. Clarke, A Herb Garden. Thomas A. Clarke, After Marvel, even less didactic content to this work. I mean, he doesn't even tell you what's going on. It's just a title on the cover, After Marvel, and these greens, which of course relate to Marvel. Another work I put into this section is Stuart Mill's Three Swallows in a River Meadow, which is in fact being made, I believe, in glass and being put up in Belper River Gardens very shortly. But here I think Stuart Mills begins to break out from a certain formality of the European order, and you know, he just makes a literalism in the poem, which I think is a result of some of the things I'm talking about. And equally, Robert Lax, American poet who lived for most of his life in Greece. This is a very abstract kind of poetry which moves somewhere else again, I think. I mean, he, being American, being a friend of Ad Reinhardt and such people, was already working in a different field from the European formality that I've been talking about. And this is just like one page of a much longer poem of Robert Lax. Needs a lot more attention, but I think it's moving somewhere else. This is 1990, I believe, this poem. And then something completely moving elsewhere to Colin Sackett's Aggregate, where he superimposes the terms from a 1 kilometre square map, part of a map, 10 by 10 squares superimposed on each other. And this layering, I think, is a completely different order of stuff from what I was just talking about. This really becomes more like the layering in LeWitt, maybe, you know, where you get this build-up of lines. But you can begin to recognize, it's important that you can recognize some of these terms as much as you can, but then they really build up into solids. And equally, there's always, from Colin, the book Black Bob, which is such an archetype that it applies to any field that you might want to talk about. You know, there's the book Black Bob on its little plinth, and there it is, paged out. There's a longer run of all the pages of Black Bob. I don't draw implications of the relationship between that and Sol LeWitt specifically, but I think it's there for the begging in some way. Another, I've just sort of, these are really just schematic and structured sort of bits of work in different formats, in different contexts from LeWitt, but I think underlying them somewhere is a process. I mean, even like this one, this is the deconstruction of a wall of envelope interiors of Erica Van Horn in a museum in Japan, where willing helpers, like LeWitt always has willing helpers, helped to take down this wall of vignettes of envelope interiors. There's a huge wall, you know. Projects like that you can only do with a team of guys, and the Japanese are really brilliant at this, to get in and help you. And so this wall was at one point about 10 meters by 15 of these vignettes, 4,500 little overloids of envelope interior, which is a project that Erica Van Horn works with, or worked with all the time around that point. I don't think I'm not going to make my 40 minutes, but I'm coming up to, you know, a 3/4 mark or something like that. But anyway, we can talk more of these things. I thought I'd just throw in a few things of my own just to see if they have any relativity to LeWitt. I don't know if they do or not, in a way. This is a box file of cards, and it's a poem called Mr. G. White, of Mrs. Green and White. And it's a series of index cards with nothing on them for the most part, apart from the odd one that says, the wave of a name in a sea of names, the name of a wave in a sea of waves, names. Sorry, yeah, that's right. It permeates this thing, odd cards in the whole thing. But again, I mean, I'm throwing these pieces out as kind of an extension of something. There's 1984. I think it was working off different aesthetics, but I think in a way I was aware of LeWitt, but only kind of intellectually, not intrinsically, I'd say at this point. But I think they may begin to beg other questions. I think certainly with this piece, which is a book called 9 Poems, which is in here installed in Cairn Gallery in Gloucestershire in 1989, the plainness of the text, the non-poetic of the text in a way, I think is influenced by the simple way of working through a kind of elemental structure in a way. I mean, it's almost begging whether it's poetry at all, you know, but there they are installed. And again, it runs from the book to the wall, and as I'm going through these last few things, I mean, they go backwards and forwards between books and installation in a way that probably wouldn't have happened, you know, without presence of Sol LeWitt. A bigger piece in Lincolnshire, History of the Airfields of Lincolnshire. Someone kindly leant their bike up against the wall here. And it's just the word poppies going along this whole frieze, which is made of slabs of cement from the airfield at Skellingthorpe in Lincolnshire. On the top, the title's on the top, but you can't see that because you're looking downwards. And just finally, just to throw in a work I just put in the bathroom at home. But this has gone back, it's gone from the book to the wall, and this is a poem called Miroir, which I think, even though this is language of sorts, it's a narrative of abstract parts in a way. I mean, LeWitt talked about wanting his forms to form a narrative. I mean, these things are completely abstract. These words are only partially abstract in a certain way, but I think they're not compositionally whole in the way that poetry is often assumed to be. And it seemed like a good work to have in a bathroom with a huge mirror as the wall, in a way. And probably some of you know the initial book, which is, tries to do the same thing, but working backwards from the back of the book to the middle, miroir. But here it is extended as a wall piece. And I just wanted to return to the dichotomy of private and public that LeWitt had inferred by that earlier statement. I don't know if I read it for you, but there is... yeah, I mean, LeWitt said that wars were public and large, and books were small and private, and that they could both give the same information. This might be true for his work, this procedural way of working he had, but it's not necessarily true for the book in all contexts at all. You know, the book can almost be an alternative catalogue, as I've talked to you about in some ways, so it can be a different reflection in some ways. But I just thought I'd tail off with that there's a kind of dichotomy between public and private I'm sort of aware of at the moment. And I think it's there in that 1968 work, that very cube. I mean, in a sense, that's kind of very personal, private thing to do, to bury your earlier work, you know. I mean, a lot of other artists were burying stuff at this time. Smithson, other people were putting stuff in the ground, glass cubes in the ground. Here, Sol LeWitt buries evidence of his earlier work in the ground. I think in a way this procedure's way of working make redundant in a way the current hyper display of the gallery, as I call it. It's just a place to work in a contemporary setting, you know, and this simple role somehow seemed to have been replaced by a fetishization of the gallery in some way as of its function. And it may be also the new digital media might also confuse the platform of publishing, but I don't think so. It somehow, for me, leaves it as an even more open, privileged position to be discovered. LeWitt's openness and generosity allowed for another way of working, a more casual encounter, perhaps, a slower interaction, a discovery game. And I'm sort of ending this with a quotation that Charles Olson used to say to his students at Black Mountain College. He said, "Don't ever be intimidated by the disdain and disinterest in the world. Get yourself some type, get yourself some paper, and print it."